The film starts with an episode of the game show To Tell the Truth from 1977, where three different men sit claiming to be Frank Abagnale Jr. The real Frank is the famous con man who pretended to be an airline pilot, lawyer, and doctor while stealing millions of dollars across 3 continents before he turned 19. We then jump to 1969, where FBI agent Carl Hanratty arrives at a French prison to pick up the real Frank Abagnale Jr. Frank is sick with the flu, but still tries to escape before getting sent back to America. The story flashes back 6 years earlier to 1963 in New Rochelle, where 16-year-old Frank lives with his father Frank Sr. and his French mother Paula. Frank thinks his dad is amazing because Frank Sr. knows how to talk people into things. One day, Frank Sr. goes to a clothing store and borrows an expensive suit for Frank. Then, he has Frank pretend to be his driver while Frank Sr. tries to get a big loan from Chase Manhattan Bank. But the bank says no because Frank Sr. owes a lot of money to the IRS. The family has to move from their nice big house to a tiny apartment. Moving to the small apartment really hurts the family. Frank figures out that his mother is sleeping with his father's friend Jack. Frank feels weird about starting at a new school, so he decides to pretend to be a substitute French teacher for a few days. Nobody at school catches on. Things keep getting worse at home between his parents until they decide to get divorced. His parents sit Frank down and tell him he has to pick which one to live with. Frank gets scared by having to make this choice, so instead he just runs away from home. He takes some blank checks that his dad had given him. Frank runs out of money pretty fast and starts pulling small scams to get by. He gets better and better at tricking people and realizes he has a real gift for it. Frank notices that people automatically respect guys in uniforms, especially airline pilots. Everyone treats pilots like they're important and trustworthy, so Frank decides to become a fake Pan Am pilot. He calls Pan Am and pretends to be someone buying uniforms for a school project, asking detailed questions about what pilots wear. Then he goes to a uniform shop and orders a complete pilot outfit, saying he's new and needs it for training. The shop owner believes him completely. The pilot uniform becomes Frank's ticket to a new life. Airlines let their workers fly free on other companies' planes through something called deadheading. Frank uses this system to travel all over America, staying in fancy hotels and eating at expensive restaurants, while all the bills go to Pan Am. Frank steals over $2.8 million this way. But Frank still needs actual cash, so he starts writing fake checks. Frank begins small but quickly learns that payroll checks and cashier's checks work better because people trust them more. Frank studies how different banks make their checks and learns to copy all of the important security features. Frank gets that most people, even bank workers, don't really know how banking works. They see official-looking papers and think they must be real. Frank creates detailed backstories for his fake checks. He's not just Frank cashing a check, he's Pilot Frank getting his paycheck, or Dr. Frank getting his insurance money. Meanwhile, FBI agent Carl Hanratty starts trying to catch him. Even though his bosses don't think check fraud is that big of a deal, Carl is really serious and never seems to have fun, but he never gives up on a case. Carl tracks Frank down to a hotel and breaks into his room to arrest him. Frank comes out of the bathroom and has to think fast. He only knows that Carl works for the FBI, so Frank pretends to be a Secret Service agent named Barry Allen. Frank tells Carl that he just caught the real criminal they're both looking for. Carl totally believes him and Frank walks right out of there. Frank tries to use his stolen money to get his parents back together. He takes his father to a fancy restaurant and gives him the keys to a brand new Cadillac. But Frank Sr. says he can't take the car because the IRS guys are still watching everything he does. Frank Sr. makes it clear that he and Paula are never getting back together. A few months later, on Christmas Eve, Carl is working late by himself when Frank calls him up. Frank says he's sorry for fooling Carl back at the hotel, but during their talk, Carl figures something out. Frank called because he doesn't have anyone else to talk to. This kid is totally alone in the world. Now, after Frank hangs up, Carl realizes that Barry Allen is the name of a comic book character from The Flash. Now, Carl knows Frank is just a teenager, which explains why they couldn't find any records on him. Carl remembers Frank saying something about the New York Yankees, so he has his guys check missing kids from New York. They find Frank's mother, who got married again. Carl sees Frank's yearbook picture and finally knows what his suspect looks like. About a year later, Frank changes his whole act again. Now, he's pretending to be a doctor with a fake degree from Harvard Medical School. He's working at a hospital in Georgia where he meets Brenda Strong, a really sweet nurse from the South. Frank falls in love with her and asks her to marry him. He wants to help her get back together with her parents, who cut her off after she had an abortion. They go to Louisiana to meet her parents, and Frank tells them he's a doctor, a lawyer, and a Lutheran just like them. Brenda's dad is a prosecutor, and he's so impressed that he asks Frank to work with him. Frank actually studies hard and passes the Louisiana bar exam to become a real assistant prosecutor. Frank decides he wants to marry Brenda and live a normal life. He goes to see his father to tell him the good news, but his dad drops a bomb on him. Frank Sr. has shut down his shop and tells Frank that his mother has remarried and started a new family. Frank is crushed by this news, and he leaves his father and calls Carl, telling him he wants to stop running because he wants to settle down with Brenda. But Carl says that's impossible since Frank stole $4 million. This is where Carl's team traces the call and starts looking through wedding announcements in newspapers to find Frank. Carl shows up at Frank and Brenda's engagement party to arrest them. Frank decides to tell Brenda the truth about everything. He shows her a suitcase full of stolen money and asks her to run away with him to Europe. Even though she's shocked, Brenda says yes and agrees to meet him at the airport in 2 days. But when Frank gets to the airport, he sees Brenda talking to FBI agents who have surrounded the whole place. Carl convinced her to help them catch Frank, but he doesn't walk into the trap. Instead, he comes up with a clever plan to escape. He pretends to work for Pan Am and tells a bunch of pretty girls that he's recruiting flight attendants for trips to Europe. Frank uses these women as a distraction and walks right past Carl's men at the airport. While they're all looking at the fake stewardesses, Frank gets on a plane and flies to Europe. A year and a half goes by and it's now 1967. Frank has been making fake checks all over Europe and Asia, but now he's gotten so good that his checks look completely real. Carl is furious and tells his boss that Frank is out of control. Carl wants permission to go to Europe and catch Frank, but his boss says no. So Carl takes one of Frank's fake checks to some professional printers. They tell him it could only have been made in a few countries in Europe. Carl remembers that Frank's mother was born in France, so he flies to her hometown. It's Christmas Eve when Carl finds out Frank's working inside a huge printing factory. Carl tells Frank that French police are outside and they'll shoot him if he doesn't give up peacefully. Frank thinks Carl is lying at first, but Carl swears he's telling the truth. Frank puts the handcuffs on himself and walks outside with Carl. When Frank doesn't see any police, he tells Carl that he's impressed by how well Carl just tricked him. But right then, French police cars show up everywhere and take Frank to prison. Frank spends 2 terrible years in a French prison before Carl comes to get him. On Christmas Eve 1969, Carl and Frank are on a plane flying back to America. Carl tells Frank some devastating news. He tells him that his father's dead, and Frank is heartbroken and somehow manages to escape from the airplane itself while it's still flying. Frank goes to find his mother's house, but when he gets there, he sees his mom living happily with a new husband and a little girl who's his half-sister. Before Frank can even talk to his mother, police cars pull up and Frank just gives up without fighting. Frank goes to court and gets sentenced to 12 years in federal prison in Atlanta for check forgery, stealing money, and a bunch of other crimes. For the next 4 years, Carl visits Frank in prison on a regular basis. During one visit, Carl shows Frank a fake check, and Frank figures out who made it just by looking at it for a few seconds. Carl is amazed by how good Frank is at spotting forgeries, so he starts bringing Frank more cases to help solve. In 1974, Carl works out a deal where Frank can get out of the prison early if he works for the FBI's fraud department. Frank has to work under Carl's supervision, and he's basically changed to a desk job. Frank misses the excitement of his old job as a con man. He even tries to pretend to be an airline pilot one more time, but Carl catches him at the airport. Instead of arresting Frank, Carl just let him go. Carl tells Frank that nobody is chasing him anymore, so the thrill is gone. Carl predicts that Frank will come back to work on Monday because there's nobody chasing you. The next Monday morning, Carl sits nervously in the office wondering if Frank will actually show up. Carl is worried that Frank ran away and ruined both of their careers. But then Frank walks in and asks Carl what case they're working on next. Carl can't help but ask Frank how he managed to pass that bar exam in Louisiana. He just studied really hard for 2 weeks and actually passed the test legitimately. The movie ends with the text on screen telling us what happened to Frank after that. Frank got happily married and stayed married for 26 years. He had 3 sons and moved to the Midwest with his family. He stayed good friends with Carl for the rest of their lives. Frank became one of the world's best experts at catching people who forged checks and other documents. He makes millions of dollars every year by helping companies create checks that can't be forged. Frank used all his criminal skills to prevent the exact same crimes he used to commit. This film is based on a true story.